Let me go ahead and get started and welcome everyone on behalf of the Cobb Institute and the Science Advisory Committee. We are here for our fourth session with Tim Eastman. We're looking at chapter 4 today, and I think it's fair to say that this is really the meat of the book. This is the longest chapter. Some of the most exciting connections that Tim is making between quantum theory, Whitehead's work, some attempts to really definitively critique and get beyond actualism. So I'm very much looking forward to what Tim has to share with us today. We also have 3 guests. George Lucas, who was just pointing out he has a box full of Whitehead's letters behind him. That's very exciting that Whitehead is sort of as close to being here among us as one could ask for in his objective immortality. We also have Anderson Weeks with us, and Alex Gomez-Marin, who will either join us shortly, or if not, I have a video from him and he'll join for the Q&A later in our session. I'll introduce each of these panelists after Tim has had time to unpack this chapter for us. One reminder, if you want to join us for the remaining sessions, don't forget to RSVP so that you will be on the email list. All right, so Tim, if you are ready, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Matt, and greetings to everyone. And well, it's a real pleasure to have George Lucas and Anderson Weeks and Alex Gomez-Marin with us. And I really appreciate this dialogue, and thanks to all of you to take a little time out on this September 11th to join in. We all should in some way recall the events of that day, and just as a reminder about why it's important to pay attention to issues at multiple levels, to attend to evidence-based thinking, not simply advocacy-based thinking, to be self-aware of the context and to not get into context denialism and historical denialism, which I think were contributing factors to the way in which we so blindly got into these issues for the last 20 years. So in my view, then, good humanistic study, not just scientism, is so helpful for those kinds of things, and would have saved us trillions of dollars with some attention to understanding the history and context, and not be getting into through false claims, getting ourselves into areas of the world and trying to apply control in which that was quite inappropriate. Anyway, so to my particular chapter 4, which is by all means the quite a large, challenging chapter. My apology for the challenge, but it is, so to speak, a set of applications of the basic concepts I have introduced in chapters 1 through 3, especially the notion of ways of knowing, for example, the way of emphasis on context, the way of context independence, which that second is the way of science, so to speak, and the way of ultimate context. And a focus on, at the most fundamental level, on process, logic, and relations as most fundamental, and specifically not space-time or metric description as fundamental as such, under the supposition of the possibility that one can derive these notions like that of the metric from the more fundamental notion of process, which is part of the claim of the process tradition. That is, process and relation is most fundamental over against substance. And in addition, then, the notion of reality. I expand the notion of reality to encompass both the actual and the possible. And that's reflected in the logic of what's called the Boolean logic of actualized outcomes of measurement and non-Boolean reference to the landscapes of possibility. That's brought up more in chapters 2 and 3. And then the notion that dualistic thinking is problematic, to map everything into simple inputs, outputs, that really what's fundamental are in some way triads, that there's always a context, that there's, or you might say input, output, context is the most fundamental way of framing the nature of things at multiple levels. And that context itself has multiple levels. So then there's emergence at multiple levels. So then what I have done, at least attempted to, at the intersection of semiotics, which is the theory of signs, information theory, process thought, and quantum physics, lies the need to distinguish two fundamental types of relations with a synchronic focus, which is more at a time, as required for the analysis of emergence in semiotics, and secondly, relations with a diachronic focus, that is in terms of the immediacy of process, as required for the analysis of fundamental quantum process and causation. The former type of relation, that is synchronic, is the focus of Paul Baines's excellent analysis, The Primacy of Semiotics, an Ontology of Relations, 2014, which fits well with the semiotic perspective in the action of signs, that is, how things come to stand for something other than themselves. And the latter type of relation, the diachronic, fits well with fundamental quantum process and succession. Recent developments in semiotics, information theory, complex systems, process thought, and quantum physics, here unified within my logoi framework, help to clarify all these issues and all join the denial of traditional nominalism. The diachronic focus, I argue, for ontological relations is key to understanding causation, and the synchronic focus is key to understanding emergence. Now, I found very helpful from a book by Menno Halswit, From Cause to Causation, a Peircean Perspective, published in 2002, a very helpful distinction between causality being about facts, a relation between cause and effect as expressed by language and propositions, thus an epistemic focus, and the term causation for the production of an effect by a cause with an ontological focus. And Halswit further noted that most contemporary discussions of the concept of cause pertain to causality rather than causation. So that helped me a lot to understand that so many of the references I'd gone through and trying to understand causality or the causal process were really focused on causality, not causation as such. The causation emergence, I argue, are complementary concepts in the logoi framework, in that causation represents a diachronic focus on fundamental process, and emergence represents a synchronic focus on that same process, that is hierarchical structure with local global constraints. Although having a synchronic focus, emergence involves as well historical and diachronic aspects. Causation is no longer confined to the mere dyadic correlation of facts, that is causality, or to deductivism as in Newtonian physics, such that novelty or emergence is an epiphenomena arising from random error or chance. The classical approach to emergence tended to treat it as merely epistemological, that is mind-dependent. Instead, via the logoi framework, I argue that causation and emergence, the diachronic and the synchronic respectively, are complementary realities bridged ontologically by fundamental quantum process and epistemologically by symbols and model representations that are created by the semiotic animal, in our case, humans. These complementary realities reflect as well the matter-symbol distinction that Howard Petit has characterized as the epistemic cut. The logoi framework represents a generalization of James Blasiewicz's constraint interpretation, brought up in his Essential Difference volume, 2012, essentially a context-based interpretation of emergence that includes initial conditions, boundary conditions, individuation and differentiation, as well as potentiae, which I use to refer to potential relations or possible relations in general. In White, one philosophical bridging concept that is extremely useful is Whitehead's concept of prehension, which is a metaphysical, that is, radically inclusive claim that all physical relations have an asymmetrical internal relational structure. As a major exemplar of this hypothesis, quantum physics shows how final system states or outcome states of quantum measurement are internally related to initial states. Further, such internal relations extend beyond the system state to include the totality of system, detector, and environment, thus reflecting a prime example of the input-output context triad. As a philosophic extension of these insights, Hartson argues that Whitehead's concept of prehension provides a middle way across numerous dichotomies and dualisms, and its dipolar character includes both the ontological diachronic syncrotic distinction, thus incorporating both causation and emergence, and the epistemological knower known or matter symbol epistemic cut. In turn, the logic of prehension is inclusive of input-output context, thus triadic and semiotic, Jamesian experience, and fundamental process. Inspired by the new field theory of James Clerk Maxwell, that is new as of the 1880s when he did his thesis at Cambridge, this is the basis, which is the basis of contemporary field theories. Whitehead innovated his concept of prehension to provide a unified approach to these aspects of fundamental reality. The integrative power of the concept of prehension is indicated by a number of key applications. For example, as a philosophical embodiment of field theory as brought out by Lehman McHenry, as ontologizing the mathematical function as philosopher James Bradley has brought out, as capturing fundamental quantum process from the non-Boolean pre-space potentia to Boolean actualities as laid out by Mike Epperson and Elias Safiris in our chapters 2 and 3 as brought out in our previous session, as bridging both ontological aspects and epistemological aspects that I've just brought out. And prehension is multi-scale, the quantum of explanation as laid out clearly by Randy Akshay and Gary Herstein. So in my chapter 4, I've brought out, say, the stages of fundamental quantum process, just a reviewing of what's in chapter 2 in terms of that characterization of the fundamental quantum process as brought out by Mike Epperson. Generalizing the function as James Bradley works out, I developed that in chapter 4. Let's see, so and then the issue of symmetry and asymmetry in science. Joe Rosen, for example, who's written a wonderful work on symmetry in science, that's his expertise as a mathematical physicist. He characterizes symmetry as immunity to a possible change. That's the most general characterization of it. But he also points out that for every symmetry, there's an asymmetry tucked away somewhere in the world. So that ultimately what you always have in quantum physics, in science more generally, and everywhere, and is both symmetry and asymmetry. And then that gets reflected in quantum statistics, what are called, for the focus on symmetry, Bose-Einstein statistics, and with a focus on asymmetry, Fermi-Dirac statistics, that then are ways in terms of quantum statistics to fundamentally understand interactions at multiple levels of atoms, molecules, and all the rest. So then I get into also to the issues of fundamental logic and modality, the distinction of Boolean and non-Boolean logical domains. I get into issues of causation and objectivation. The latter is a concept that Anderson Weeks, who's with us, has worked on. The emergence of physical relationships, about the comments on the theories of everything, and I do a critique of such theories, arguing that and they tend to just reduce everything to Boolean description only, which is an incomplete characterization. I get into the notion that physical law, instead of, say, being God-given in the way we thought up through the 18th century, that fundamental physical relations, or quote laws unquote, in contemporary physics and conservation principles derive primarily from variational principles, such as the principle of least action, which contingently optimize from among a full array of possible trajectories and appropriately formulated phase spaces given particular relevant histories, including initial conditions and boundary conditions. Thus, quote, law, unquote, is a byproduct of constraints on possibility. So it's sort of generalizing a constrained interpretation of what we think of as lawful relation and law. And considering that each and every event is a result of fundamental quantum process, and that in turn necessarily involves input, output, context, part whole, and local global relations, all multi-scale, we can now see that fundamental succession of events, you might say one darn thing after another, is like a weaving together of potentia and actualizations, as argued by Ruth Kastner, who was with us in the last session. This weaving together, utilizing a landscapes of potentia, builds on causation, yet with attention to both constraints and context. Then I have a section getting into issues of modeling relations and complex systems, as Robert Rosen in his great work Anticipatory Systems has developed. Then I talk about landscapes of potentia as discussed by Alicia Herrero and others. And then biophilosophy as brought up by works of Spirido and Kotrofinas and others. Sort of new approaches to biophilosophy that can go beyond the standard model for evolution, which is incomplete in that it focuses just on competition and the limited constraints there, and not on a combination of competition and cooperation. You really need both in a more robust biophilosophy. And also an organism's dynamics, as Kotrofinas argues, would inevitably enter phases in, say, the phase space for description of the system that would diverge strongly, almost certainly derailing into fatal disorganization, that the essence of each living occasion is an anticipatory capability with anti-entropic effect, and that this, so that living systems require, so to speak, these aspects of order and well, there's always a disorder aspect, but there's multiple levels of ordering, and that those orderings necessarily involve types of nonlinear coordination and the overcoming of disorder by through cooperative effect and the anticipatory system effects. And anyway, there's details of this that are brought up by Kotrofinas that go beyond what I have, but there's levels of emergence on pages 147 to 150 that I address, of first order, second order emergence, third order emergence, fourth order emergence, that get at these issues, I think, in somewhat a new way. I provide extensive references on them. And then another point I want to just bring up before I close, and that is, I think there's a real potential for synergy between the process tradition and current research worldwide in semiotics. Just as I see causation and emergence as complementary, the diachronic and the synchronic, so I see efforts and research in the process tradition and semiotics to be complementary and synergistic, but this has not been taken advantage of very much, and I think there's so much potential for that as well. With that, I will close and pass on to my esteemed colleagues and respondents. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that guided tour through the chapter, Tim. And I will start with Alex Gomez-Marin, who I don't think is here, but I do have a video from him, so we'll start with him. Let me share my screen. All right.
I would like to thank you, Matt, for your invitation, and also to John Cobb for your generosity.
Sorry, let me introduce Alex. Alex is the principal investigator at the Behavior of Organisms Lab at the Institute of Neuroscience in Spain. And hopefully he'll be able to join us in a few minutes here for the dialogue. But yeah, here are his comments.
I would like to thank you, Matt, for your invitation, and also to John Cobb for your generosity and for your wisdom. All right, so I've benefited a lot from the critique of actualism of Eastman's book. And this is really fascinating to me and very, very useful as a neuroscientist, especially when it comes to the hot topic of localization of memories. So without this being already a question, let me just pose it that I think there's a lot of theoretical implications that could be drawn from the distinction between the actual and the virtual, or potential, as Eastman likes to call it, when it comes to rephrasing the question, where are memories in the brain? As a Bergsonian, although this is already more than 100 years old, I think this is a question that has a lot of relevance today. So here are my three main blogs of comments, reflections, mostly questions that if you would like to engage during the remainder of the session or in other sessions, I would very much appreciate. So having said that, I really enjoy the conceptual framework laid out by Eastman. I'm wondering, and here I'm thinking aloud, because that's what I wonder when I read philosophy and when I read theoretical biology as a theoretical physicist turned neurobiologist, which is what I am. So, and that's also a question I get from my colleagues. The question is, what experiment would you do next? So that's the first thing I would like to ask Dr. Eastman and anyone else in the audience. Given this fantastic set of ideas and deep reflections, philosophical, theoretical, what experiment would we do next in the lab? So how could we bring Eastman and Whitehead in the lab? Because there's a difference between interpretation of experiments, the discussion section in a paper, if you want, and one can do a lot of good work there by just calling attention to other ways of just interpreting the facts. And that's actually one of the dangers I see in science, that we present facts, but then we also present our metaphysics underneath and pretend it's not there. So sure, yes, interpretation of experiments is very important, but what about design of new experiments? So what would be the empirical program? I'm thinking more of the life and mind sciences, but also for physics. I'm more interested in the life and mind sciences. So in other ways, what would be a new, non-trivial, empirically testable hypothesis that we could draw from this body of work? So that's the first main question or reflection, the empirical program of such a conceptual framework. And the second one, if I may play a bit with words, like the book talks a lot about the importance of context. So I'm going to ask about meta-context, which is, what would Eastman or Whitehead do if they were in a hiring committee? So this is a question about the socio-political milieu. Not so much the empirical program, but the socio-political milieu that we have today. And it varies across disciplines. Even within the sciences, it can be very different to be a biologist, a chemist, a physicist, or even within the neurosciences, there are many types. But what is clear is that there's a selection mechanism going on, and there's socio-political, economic reasons, forces there. But I think it's very important because recalling the so-called possibility of the 21st century being a Whiteheadian century, whether it is or not, what it's clear is that not all good ideas or great ideas, great insights will not suffice. I think if we don't change the mechanisms that go on in academia. Maybe a route is to do it in a parallel track without all these bad habits and pervasive incentives we have in academia. So this is the second main question or reflection, right? The hiring committee or the socio-political milieu, where this set of ideas could really be seeds that flourish. Third, this is more concrete. So again, being a physicist already swimming in the waters of biology for more than a decade, I have like a split soul or personality or whatever you may call it. And when I read all this emphasis on quantum mechanics, I think I understand it to the degree that I learned it. But I'm often not so convinced, or I'm wary of what I call smallism. I mean, we read in Eastman's book that ultimately reality, everything should be grounded in quantum mechanics. Well, I mean, Sure, it's maybe the most fascinating theory we have, the most precise, incredible predictions, and conceptually super juicy. Well, different interpretations still going on. Scientists do not care, usually, especially reductionist mechanistic scientists, because it doesn't help to pursue their agenda. Then New Age took it and made what it could of it. So, well, in any case, my point here is, let me put it in a question. So, what could Dr. Eastman or you, what could you make use of living organisms? Or what could living organisms offer to your interpretation, to your speculation, to your integrative framework? Another way to put it, what would fruit flies or mice offer that stones and quarks cannot offer to your theory? And yes, I don't want to fall into the bifurcation of nature here, but perhaps physics is nested within biology rather than biology as a kind of a interesting application of ideas that are in physics, always with this what I call a bias, this bias in mind that reality is a building, and since the smallest building blocks are quantum, therefore, yeah, quantum is the basis of everything. And along these lines, this third type of question or reflection, I would like Dr. Eastman or whoever wants to intervene to comment on Capek's view of Bergson and Bergson's important remarks about the biological theory of knowledge, right? I like when Eastman writes, I think it's at the beginning in the intro, or no, there's no intro, the first chapter, right? That we're between the Umwelt and a God's eye view, right? Between the Umwelt and a God's eye view, but all of these speculations we're doing are framed within our evolved brains and minds. And if I have time, a fourth question reflection regarding human experience. So it's fantastic that's stated as a starting point for Eastman's project. And there's this quote, dipping without defying it. Well, maybe one could clarify what's meant by defying it, but in any case, my question here is, I mean, I see an integration of a lot of great thinkers, but I'm missing, maybe because I'm a Whiteheadian as well, but a phenomenologist, and so I'm missing what could Husserl's phenomenology offer here, and maybe a good contemporary example of a physicist actually working on, has worked on quantum mechanics and consciousness and life and mind sciences, Michel Dubol in Paris. So what or how does this line of thinking integrate with the really impressive abstractions in this book? Okay, well, so I think that's more than enough, and any thread you want to pursue based on that, I'll be happy and grateful. Thank you.
All right, so those are Alex's thoughts. You know, I just want to say before I introduce our next panelist that, Tim, I thought your opening statements in regard to today being 9/11, about the importance of evidence-based rather than advocacy-based inquiry, and also what you said about the importance of history and context for research. I thought that those 2 points spoke directly to Alex's question about the hiring committee and how you deal with these issues around the sociology of knowledge and whatnot. So you kind of preempted his question there. So let's go now in alphabetical order and have by last name, George Lucas, who's Professor Emeritus of Ethics and Public Policy at the Postgraduate School and Naval Institute in Monterey, California. He's taught at many other universities. He's also the author of a couple of great books on Whitehead, including The Rehabilitation of Whitehead. Really enjoyed that text. So George, the floor is yours. I look forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Thank you, Matt. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, great. I wanted to echo something. I had it in my remarks, but I'll lift it up right now before the point gets lost about the different starting places, whether we start with quantum mechanics or classical physics on the one hand, or with biology. What would the fruit fly tell us about Tim's synthesis? I think since my brain is about the size of a fruit fly, I think there would be a similar difficulty in trying to absorb all of the insights Tim tries to offer, as I'll say more about that in a moment. But I think it is interesting that Whitehead himself, the mathematician, logician, and physicist, nonetheless, certainly by the time he came to Harvard and even before, had been moving towards biology as the root metaphor and the root discipline in which to expand in both directions in a relational way towards psychology and neuroscience and so forth, and sort of backwards down the chain of being, if you can use that phrase in these days, towards fundamental physical constituents. Never reducing one to the other, but trying to understand the relations between them, but for some reason abandoning his own disciplinary background to work more in the life sciences as a clue. What are we to make of that? And is there enough of that in Tim's work as he starts what is tradition among physicists to work from the subatomic world and kind of build our way upwards? I missed the last couple of sessions, and so I had to do a lot of homework to get ready for today. And I don't want to bore you by going over things that we've already talked about, but Tim has mentioned some of them this morning and does in this integral chapter 4, which I think is in a way a key to the book as far as I can see it. Not merely because, as he pointed out, it's as long as the preceding 3 chapters combined, but it contains the first attempt to synthesize all the insights from those chapters into some of the most fundamental of the Gordian knot problems that he enumerates, the baker's dozen of those in chapter 3. Anyway, I'm myself familiar with only a fraction of these topics and of the literature that he cites. I find it very impressive, but also kind of overwhelming. I know some of the major figures, and I have to say, in passing, I was especially heartened to see another synthetic and wide-reaching mind playing an important role in Tim's synthesis, and that is James Bradley of Memorial University, our late colleague, who was so brilliant. And a sidebar, for those of you who know something about Bradley, including what Tim does a beautiful job of presenting here, Sean McGrath at Memorial University has just published a collection of James Bradley's work. It just came out, I think, last week. Sean himself is a Schelling scholar, so Tendika and others of you who work on Schelling may already know him, but he was a very eager and earnest and devoted colleague of James Bradley, and now has published his collected works in a way that I think will give a sense of his contribution to Tim's overall project here. Okay, so if we remember those charming autobiographical reflections that opened the book, the author's, Tim Eastman's, youthful sense of wonder about all these things in the world can be and how and whether they are related. Tim himself constantly, as he did this morning, again, expresses some skepticism about Stephen Hawking's theory of everything. But this work seems to me to result in a theory of, if not everything, then nearly everything, simply because context and relatedness, Plato's logoi, those tentative hypotheses about how specific things work that are then linked up together and finally interconnected, they all constitute those entangling strands of the Gordian knot that he seeks to unravel. The one I wanted to focus on was towards the end of his comments this morning, causality and causation, but also their relation of those twin concepts to emergence and complexity, and ultimately to consciousness. It seems to me that there's an additional, maybe we'd call it a 14th implicit Gordian knot thread that permeates Eastman's discussion, but it's never fully or explicitly discussed. And it's the very thing that I said at the outset that Alex mentioned in his comments. What Tim discusses explicitly is causal closure and physicalism. The physicalism follows from this doctrine of causal closure, that everything physical has a physical cause, every cause yields a physical effect exclusively with no overlap and no additional material. Whether it's Boolean or non-Boolean, it's still a closed kind of system. It can be triadic, it can be non-Boolean, but it cannot be non-physical, non-physics related. And that, as Tim describes it and criticizes it, is the kind of dogma, the underlying metaphysical assumption that you are required, doctrine, you're required to accept in order to correspond to the scientific point of view. And that doctrine is laid down by the actualism, the mechanist, determinist. So that doctrine always left the problem that I think Tim is working on here. What are the relations, if you will, between the scientific domains themselves, the physical, the chemical, the biological, the psychological? All are constrained to be reduced to physical explanation by causal closure, which limits the notion of causation at the expense of either epistemic complexity or ontic excess and overload. There's no emergence of any kind in such a world, supervenient, epistemic, or otherwise. And that, I think, is the answer to the question I posed at the outset. Why did Whitehead start with biology? Because if you didn't start there, you'd never get there. And I think that's an important factor that we have to wrestle with in this interdisciplinary conversation we have, that so frequently we try to start at the beginning, or at the bottom, if you will, and work our way up, and we never get there. So Whitehead didn't do that. He suggested a way we could start in, as it were, in the middle, in the throne world in which we ourselves inhabit, or from which we ourselves emerge, that is most like us, and then work outward to the things that are least like us. And Tim himself did work that I wish he had said more about in the book. He says a lot in passing, but boy, over the years, what I learned from Tim Eastman was a lot about plasma physics and the importance, which still amazes me to this day. I don't think we've come to terms with it. The way in which these enormous ionic systems, they're physical systems, no doubt about it, but their connectedness, their relatedness, their responsiveness, the notion of causation in them, the speed with which they interact with one another, and the distance and scale over which that takes place, seems to me to provide a powerful metaphor for what he's describing in terms of relational and non-dyadic causality. Tim got his degree in Alaska, and I suspect that there were probably a lot of times to observe some of those magnetosphere phenomena up there, or in Iceland, Finland, wherever it may be. But they are challenges explicitly in the physical world to the principle of causal closure and to classical mechanistic concepts of causality within a relational concept. And the other thing I wanted to highlight that I thought underscored the importance of his insight in this synthesis of his is the principle of least action. You mentioned that in passing, Tim, and you do several times in the book. You could ask it in terms of a causal question. What causes, for the physicalist, what are we to say? What causes a particle trajectory to conform to the principle of least action? The principle, if you look it up, has a lot of different, and some of them rather convoluted explanations. But the action is the name given to things like angular momentum, or the difference between the potential and kinetic energy of a system at any single point in its behavior. You freeze frame the picture of the system and see what its, I think the mathematical term, physical term is Lagrangian. What is the scalar that sums the total of kinetic and potential energy? And what you want to do is minimize the difference between the two. That's least action at every point that the system, or every state that the system takes on, from initial conditions to its end. But is it the principle constraining the system to behave in conformity with it like a law? Or is it, as Tim describes it, a constraint on the system that yields the law as an insight about how systems operate? They operate so as not to waste energy, you might say, or to minimize entropy. There are various ways one can describe this. I remember discovering it as a young student of physics in my junior year, teaching myself the calculus of variations, and then developing, according to the principle of least action, the things we had always been given as results, but never derived ourselves, like the shortest distance between 2 points on a sphere or something, can be derived in this way. But interestingly enough, you can use the same mathematical technique in quantum mechanics to yield the Schrodinger equations, as well as in classical physics, where once you had understood how to calculate a simple variable called the Lagrangian of a very complicated mechanical system of pulleys and wheels and God knows what going on that you couldn't possibly write the equations of motion for in Newtonian terms, you could write down this simple scalar, take its first integral, second integral, and get the equations of motion of a otherwise impossibly complex system. And that's what you do in quantum mechanics as well. It's the kind of tie-in between classical and quantum mechanics. And all of it suggests the point that Tim makes throughout the book, especially in this chapter: context matters. The information about the system is contained within the system as a whole. It isn't something to be set apart from and derived independently of. It is part of the operation of the system. And there's no way a strictly mechanistic explanation can give an account of that. And I think for that reason, even early on, the principle of least action was looked at with great suspicion by classical physicists. They thought, just as we began to think in the 80s, 70s and 80s, there was something suspicious going on in their physical world, and now in our quantum world with things like Bell's theorem, the EPR experiment, non-localized connectivity in quantum mechanics. I still feel like I don't begin to understand how all that works. And I get a sense of greater insight by reading, especially this chapter, but Tim's book as a whole. But it's certainly, I can see the fact that we can't simply operate with the simple-minded principle of closure, the COP, that the physicalists and the actualists operate with. But I don't know quite where to go from there with Bell's theorem, Henry Stapp, who Tim mentioned in passing this morning. I see that the keys to understanding these things are here, but I'm back to the brain of the fruit fly, that mine is not capable of encompassing it all. But I thank you for the effort, Tim, and I think it's a marvelous summa or magnum opus on your part.
Thank you, George. So let's move on to our final speaker, and then we can all engage in some dialogue among the panelists and Tim, and then we'll open it up to the floor for everyone else, okay? So next is Anderson Weeks. He describes himself as an occasional Whiteheadian. He's been teaching at Fairfield University, and he's the editor of a book that I teach. I teach a course on process approaches to consciousness that's named after a book that he edited, which I find very useful. So Anderson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. I didn't know that, and I'm very flattered. Thank you. And we'll have to talk because you might be the only people buying that book. Okay, thank you so much. And Tim, thank you for having me. Tim refers in this chapter to a group of 3 papers that are in that book. And it's these are very long papers and they're complicated papers. And I'm surprised to hear that you're teaching them. That's amazing. I'm really flattered, but I think a lot of people are not familiar with them. And I thought what I would try to do is summarize some of the points I make so we can see how Tim might have caught Tim's attention, how they dovetail with some of the ideas in the logoi framework. And I'll cover, if I can, one argument from each paper, but let's see how far I get. I take a mostly historical approach in the papers because Whitehead himself says that he gets his ideas from the history of philosophy. And it's Whitehead's ideas about causation and consciousness that I'm focusing on. And the idea is that if Whitehead really does get his ideas from the history of philosophy, then we should be able to clarify those very abstract ideas by looking at their historical prototypes. And so that's what I did. I kind of worked from the history back to an interpretation of Whitehead. Now, the resulting interpretation was not without surprises. For one thing, it ascribes much more importance to potentiality than is customary. And before I go into details about the different papers, I'll just give one really good example of what I mean. I realized that before the so-called forms of potential definiteness, the eternal objects, before they can take on any relevance to the creative advance, Whitehead postulates that there must already be a completely indeterminate potentiality that makes becoming possible in the first place. And I think that's evident when Whitehead says creativity is without character of its own, but is nevertheless an active potentiality, and compares it to Aristotle's prime matter, to Plato's receptacle, and above all to Lucretius's flying dart that passes beyond the outer limit of the world into nothingness. The implication, as I see it, the implication of these ancient references is that becoming does not begin with anything definite, but with a blank slate, an ontological vacuum that draws what is out of the settled past, out of its settled state in the past. And that dislocation of actuality unsettles it. And it takes some doing for things to settle down again. But when things settle down again, the process repeats. And so here's the claim that I make. For Whitehead, becoming happens because potentiality is itself a real force. And what the logic of the ancient prototype suggests is that this real potentiality is the impending future, and that its disruptiveness, its unstoppable disruptiveness, its disruptiveness is unstoppable because, like Plato's receptacle, it is a, quote, pure potentiality that is nothing actual in itself. That's all language from the Timaeus. Now, this might not sound like the Whitehead we know, but I think Whitehead's commitment to this paradigm is demonstrated when he stresses that the so-called real future, which does have a definite structure that we can anticipate, is not an innate feature of creativity, but a contingent property of the actual world. It's something that each new occasion must inherit and conform to before anything else can happen. Now that's my intro. It's meant to be a provocative teaser. I want to say something a little bit more specific about the arguments in each of the three papers. Time permitting, I'll come back at the end to the argument I was just making, because that's mostly in the third paper. And I meant to be keeping track of time, and I forgot. How am I right now, Matt? Because I'm going to start keeping track.
Like 7 or 8 more minutes, if possible.
Okay, good. That's fine. Okay, so in in Whitehead's unique approach to the topic of consciousness, I showed how close Whitehead is to Kant in the conception of his project. They both sought the solution to the problem of causation, namely how distinct events can be necessarily connected in the conditions of the possibility of experience. The difference between them was in what they counted as experience. Whitehead rightly observes modern philosophers think clear and distinct experience is the only true experience. Anything that seems vague or obscure is assumed to be a deficient representation of something that in itself is clear and distinct. So my favorite example, the pain of being punched in the face, was taken by early modern philosophers to be a confused perception of an event that in itself was sharply defined. That meant to cognize this event properly, it would have to be represented as a set of variations among primary qualities. The notorious problem with this approach is that the most important thing about the event, the way I am causally affected by someone assaulting me, can't be represented in the required way as a distribution, a change in the distribution of primary qualities. So the most important thing, the causal aspect of it, just goes missing. And from that, Whitehead concludes that the so-called confused perception is actually a more fundamental and informative perception, and that the solution to the problem of causation has to be sought in the conditions of the possibility of the confused kind of perception rather than the clear and distinct kind. So then the big question is, what does Whitehead think those conditions of possibility are? In Consciousness and Causation, I tried to show that one of the most important conditions was logical fuzziness. And this is one way that this obviously dovetails with the Logoi framework. I pointed out that the skeptical critique of causation, it's not just a problem that was dumped on us by one singularly eccentric Scotsman. It can be found in almost every philosophical tradition, in almost every period in the history of philosophy, and almost always in exactly the same form. It's always powered by the same insistence on strict logical dichotomies. For example, here's one version of it. The alleged cause is either externally related to the effect, and so not necessarily related, or it is internally related, and so not a separate event that could stand in a causal relation to it. So either way, you don't get causation as it's conventionally understood. Now, even if the skeptical critique, the skeptical rejection of necessary connection is wrong, even if it's wrong, there's got to be something right about it, something that's motivating the critique if it keeps coming back. What the objection comes down to is that the concept of causation is incoherent, that it postulates relata that are simultaneously identical and separate, same and different, one and two, internally and externally related, yada, yada, yada. So what about this critique is sufficiently right that it can never be driven away for very long? How about this? What if everything about it is right? So let's try this out. Suppose I go to a museum and I see a blurry looking photograph on the wall. There are two possibilities. The photo is clear and my vision is bad, or my vision is great, but the photo is actually blurry in itself. So let's see if we can apply that. Let's suppose it's true that the only seemingly direct experience we ever have of causation is a vague and obscure feeling. That could be because our cognitive access to the phenomenon of causation is deficient, or it could be because that's the sort of thing causation is. Suppose it's true that the concept of causation is a fuzzy amalgam of contradictory properties. That could mean it's a defective concept, but couldn't it also be the adequate concept of a fuzzy non-Boolean sort of thing? The proposal is not completely far-fetched. It's out there, but it's not completely far-fetched. Whitehead, just like Bergson, he shows that if time is a continuity of becoming, then there is indeed no place in the world for fuzzy beings. That means causation doesn't exist, and the continuity of things over time becomes a rather puzzling mystery. However, if time is the becoming of continuity, which is something that happens discontinuously in finite episodes or spurts, then something like causation is possible. It's what happens behind the curtain while continuity of the present with the past is still being manufactured. The outcome of that process is an actual world of continuity in which there is indeed no place for fuzziness. But there is still a place for fuzziness behind the scenes. The process in which continuity is still coming to be, what Whitehead calls concrescence, is unavoidably fuzzy because it is the process by means of which a new event gains membership in a public Boolean world. Before it completes the requirements for initiation, it can't be Boolean. Now, this is obvious ties with the Logoi framework. I'm not sure how well it squares with the framework, so I hope that's one of the things we can talk about in the discussion. And this is not a bad place for me to stop, or if I have time, I can talk about the third paper, which is perhaps the more provocative one that I mentioned at the beginning. You tell me, Matt, whether I should stop here or go on for a couple more minutes.
Can you fit that into 2 or 3 minutes?
I can, exactly.
Do it. Do it.
Okay, so this is the paper that I guess, worked some people up. In Consciousness as a Topic of Investigation in Western Thought, I insisted on taking Whitehead's rehabilitation of certain ideas in Plato and Aristotle at full face value. I then found myself forced to draw some very surprising conclusions. To be clear, I'm still talking about the conditions of the possibility of our experience of causation. I argued that Whitehead believes there must be a faculty of becoming, and it must function like Kant's faculty of receptivity while having the peculiar characteristics of Plato's receptacle and Aristotle's passive mind. Why is that? Because if there is to be causation, if the past is to constrain what can happen in the present, then just like Plato's receptacle and Aristotle's passive mind, the faculty of becoming must be a pure potentiality that is nothing in itself. If that condition isn't satisfied, then the faculty itself, not the past acting on it, but the nature of the faculty itself would constrain what the faculty can become. We would thereby lose all the virtues of the Platonic Aristotelian model, according to which the faculty assimilates perfectly to whatever is acting on it. Instead, we would be falling back into the Kantian trap, where receptivity limits and distorts what it receives, thereby turning every effect it experiences into an opaque phenomenon that conceals rather than reveals what has caused it. And what is this faculty of becoming? Well, it's what Whitehead calls creativity. At least it overlaps with creativity when Whitehead says creativity is without character of its own, and compares it to the compares the necessary unity of an occasion's creative advance to Plato's receptacle. However, Whitehead also compares the impetus of creativity to Lucretius's flying dart, from which we can infer that the faculty of becoming is nothing other than the future, whose perpetual immanence overshadows everything actual, with the possibility of becoming different. And the final point here in this section, finally, the present cannot be what's after the past and before the future on a continuous timeline. That's the way it looks in retrospect, as a clearly defined interval of publicly measurable time. But the real present is something that happens, and it happens because the perpetually imminent future, by its very nature, can't resist being actualized by what's already actual. The real lived present is something that actuates out of an encounter between a looming potentiality and an already extant actuality. That means the lived present is a process of becoming in which the past and the future are somehow simultaneously present. And that's another reason why the becoming of continuity can't possibly be Boolean. That's another great place for me to stop, unless you want to hear another 2 minutes. You tell me.
I think we'll transition there, Anderson. Thank you for your thoughts and interesting provocations. So let's take a few minutes now to allow Tim to respond to anything he'd like, and then if any of the panelists want to chime in to clarify or whatnot, and then we'll open it up to everyone. So go ahead, Tim.
Well, thanks to all of you for excellent comments and notes of real substance of their own. I really appreciate that. Well, I was excited to hear from George Lucas about these new materials from Whitehead's physically right there in your office. That's exciting. So I look forward to that. Let's see, it was brought up at one point, I forget by whom, about the issue of the theory of everything. I was careful in the book that when I'm talking about the theory of everything with the acronym TOM, that I'm referring to those conventional uses where it's, so to speak, within a scientific model. That is a model based upon the presumption of actualism, of a Boolean description, that everything can be reduced to scientific propositions, ultimately, so to speak, as George described a physicalist position. So I'm saying that necessarily a theory of everything in that sense, a TOE, a theory of everything, is incorrect because it's intrinsically limited. It presupposes things that are demonstrably false, I would say, both from the science and the philosophy. That is the claim that everything reduces to nothing but Boolistic description. So it's conceivable to make sense of a philosophical theory of everything in some sense. But in my view, the claim of a scientific theory of everything is hubris and in some sense unscientific because it violates the radical openness of the scientific process itself. Then it also came up about the issue of, well, am I in my descriptions presuming somehow that things reduce to nothing but quantum description at some micro level, sort of like a hidden smallism. Well, I would, I think I tried to be clear, and I deny smallism. So part of the whole argument about the complementary character of causation emergence had to do with the way that even though there's a quantum description associated with every thing in the world without limit, that there's necessarily multiple levels of that, both in scale and in time and spatial scale, that there's multiple levels that come out of complex systems theory and physically just the sheer scale of phenomena. And that there, as Elise Smolin has argued, that there's both bottom-up and top-down causal relations associated with those processes at multiple scale, which have always inevitably some associated quantum aspect to description, but it's not reducible to somehow the small per se. So I do not subscribe to smallism. I think the metaphor of biology that Whitehead was beginning to work with, that certainly was there in Bergson's work and building up early in the century, and I think that we now have seen within the past few decades with the developments by Robert Rosen in anticipatory dynamics and developments in complex systems theory, why a organismic understanding of systems in general is much preferred to simply some kind of reductionist physicalist description. And of course that ends up having tie-ins with phenomenology and those more organic and even semiotic descriptions of the nature of things. So my attempt was tying these things together, including even linking together some elements of the science with process-oriented understandings and semiotics and phenomenology, which I briefly referred to. But it's it's so I think that that there's a lot of levels here. There was let's see, in terms of experimental test, Alex brought this up, and so that's, I think there's a certain combination of these factors, both certain propositions or certain issues in which there is a coupling between the science and the philosophy, such as, for example, in the basic logic of the Boolean and non-Boolean have a correlation with the descriptions of the actual and the possible. I think that there is some testing possible there, and I think some of that has been done in terms of the coherence with existing quantum experiments. I think, and this has been argued by Epperson Zaffiris, that you have to make this distinction, and this distinction of the Boolean and non-Boolean, in order to make sense of the whole set of available quantum experiments. So I'd say in that sense, there has been an experimental test, and it has been affirmative in sense of supporting our basic understanding of the quantum physics and affirming the fact that you have to accommodate both the physics and the logic and the philosophical aspects in an integrated understanding. You can't reduce it to just descriptions of measurement outputs and their correlations and some given metric in a metric description. And then lastly, in terms of the importance of, say, space-time description metric, it has been typically presupposed through much of the past century, and especially in terms of highly theoretical models based on Einstein's approach which was very successful in terms of fundamental process. Relativity theory is correct with respect to those correlations. But in terms of applying it to cosmology considerations, the book by Randy Akshay and Gary Herstein has been very articulate, for example, in showing how that kind of model-centric representation is very problematic, and I think fundamentally wrong. And it's because you can't simply reduce everything to, that physical processes, space-time description and metric description are very useful in terms of outputs of specific measurements and the correlations, but space-time metric itself, I think, is emergent from the fundamental process in associated. And there's been new results indicating that, for example, general relativity theory might actually be emergent from quantum field theory. This would be this, and this is testable. And I think if that ultimately comes out the way it is, that is that the unified field theory would come about by virtue of realizing that that the basic gravity physics would be emergent from, and in space-time description, from the fundamental quantum field theory, and that's testable. And so that would be a test, so to speak, of the hypothesis I'm putting together, that what's fundamental is process logic relations and not space-time metric description, for example. That's enough for now.
Thank you, Tim. Does anyone on our panel want to chime in, or should we open it up to comments and questions from the rest of our participants? Okay.
Is Alex going to be joining us, or are we at a loss today?
Unfortunately, I don't see him here, so
Okay.
I think, yeah, he was in transit or something and thought he might be able to join, but unfortunately.
If I could just address a quick follow-up to Tim, because there's one of his basic contrasts I'm still having trouble understanding. It's the causality versus causation. Tell me if I'm right or wrong. By causality, you mean gnomic regularity, and by causation, you mean an actual instance of production, or have I misconstrued it?
Let's see. Menno Halswit, my understanding is that the causality is not gnomic regularity per se. It's the causality is focusing on the epistemological aspect of the causal process, on output measurements and their correlation, and the scientific constraints on how one thinks about that and doing associated philosophy of such constraints. Whereas the causation is pointing to fundamental process and, so to speak, elements of Whitehead's description of causation, that's sort of, so to speak, a pointer to the fundamental quantum process. So causality is more what, say, typical philosophy of science does about causal process, whereas causation is a pointer to the fundamental ontological process that that process philosophy tends to really focus on. And let's see, and that's why I make the distinction of the causality versus causation distinction helps me with tying into the distinct approaches of process thought and semiotics.
Thank you.
So at this point, if anyone would like to ask a question or make a comment, please feel free. I'll give you a minute to think about that. If anyone...
May I just make a note here about George Lucas brought up the issue about causal closure of the physical, which is a very key, often a presupposition of scientists, physicists especially. But making the distinction of the Boolean and non-Boolean description is going beyond that the presumption of the causal closure of the physical. So it's a by presupposing causal closures of the physical, then you get into, so to speak, the notion that everything can be reduced to nothing but scientific propositions. I would argue that based upon the fundamental logical distinction that Epperson Zephyrus raised, and that I argue in the book, of the distinction of the Boolean and the non-Boolean, of the logic of the actual and logic of the possible, that we go beyond that kind of presumption, however useful it is for analyzing particular science problems.
Well, is there someone who has a question or comment ready? If not, I have a follow-up for Tim there, but I'll hold that for a second. Yes, Thendeka, I don't know if that, you can unmute if you'd like and ask your... Hold on a second, we gotta unmute, there we go.
Great, thank you. This question is for Anderson.
Oops.
Okay.
Who's speaking?
Tandeka.
And
Oh, there you go, go ahead.
Okay, if the future can't resist becoming actual, then does that mean that in order to change the future, you have to go back to the past and there actualize a potential which was not actualized at that moment, which is embedded, Gödel's theory, within the past, but when actualized, already begins to change the future's direction?
Thank you. What an amazing question. I believe so. One reason I'm pretty sure this is a correct interpretation is that it explains why the first phase of concrescence is always a conformal phase that repeats the past. And that's actually how causation works. Nothing new can get started without first completely assimilating to repeating what was, and then it can build on that. But that means whatever it can do is already constrained by the past it's repeated or sort of ingested. And you're saying, well, doesn't that mean the only way you can change is by going back? Of course, Whitehead says the future is real. Now, of course, that's not part of, it's not really the future. It's a future, it's a property of the already existing world and what can be when it's already limited. But yes, you have to go back. The nascent occasion, the emerging occasion has to assimilate that past that has exactly this lattice of possibilities in it, and you have to work with those. That is causation. You can't, there's no being completely reborn. Descartes is wrong. You can't just start over. The past is really there. You have to appropriate it, and then once you appropriate it, you have to work within the limits it sets on you. It doesn't mean you can't change it, but you have to, and that's why there's continuity. That's why what ends up becoming is continuity with the past. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, in that with Gödel, right? within any complete system, there is something that cannot be determined by the system. And thus, when you go back to the past, you're determining something that was past that has not yet been determined. And that's the link to the future's difference.
Say it again, because I think this is exactly what Whitehead intended. You know, his process of concrescence of one, so the subject object alternation is modeled really on the theory of types. It's, the theory of types as time. So say what you said again, please.
Yes. So Gödel's theorems of incompleteness claims that in any complete set theory, there will be a term that cannot be identified, cannot be determined by the set itself. So the set is complete, but you cannot determine whether it's true. Thus, following Gödel, which Tim emphasizes in his work, there is within any complete theory, any complete set, a past set, say, something that cannot be determined by the set itself, by those terms. So if you go back to the past and you say, well, it's complete because it's the past, no, it's not, because embedded within it is that which was not actualized in the past, but nevertheless is a part of it, but was indeterminate. So if you actualize it, you therefore quite literally are actualizing something in the past, which is now in the future.
I believe that is a perfect logical model of what I was saying.
Mind you, it can't undo something already actualized.
Right, but that which is in the past pertains to something that was not actualized at the time. That's Gödel's argument.
So
And yours too, Tim, as I understand it.
Each occasion totalizes the past. So that's a totalized set, but it's not part of that set. Now you're saying the only way it could do something is to, in a way, go back to that set, go back and inhabit that set that it's not really part of. And you're saying right there, that's what Gödel said. There's in there something that doesn't really fit already. You don't have to wait till the future. It's somehow already there.
Right, and when you're actualizing it in the past, you're actualizing the future.
No, you can't. Yeah, but there is a duration. There's a complexity about this problem. I mean, it's not the present shouldn't be thought of as absolute, say, knife edge, whatever. But on the other hand, once something's actualized, you can't undo it. You can't literally time travel to the past. Time travel is science fiction only.
But each occasion is actualizing. It is Whitehead says conforming to, repeating the past. And for his theory of causation to work, it really has to be the past itself that is being received, I think. And so that the concrescence is a space in which, well, it happens all the time. When I see something, I think it's present. Well, it is my present, but the thing I'm seeing is really past. So there is a weird simultaneity of the past and the present. And that's one reason why the concrescence can't be Boolean. And insisting that it be either past or present, not both, that's how the arguments against causation always work. And so this is not about traveling to the past, but the fact that you are, without assimilating to or conforming to the world as it was, you don't have any options. But as soon as you do that, you have options. And sorry, I don't know your name, you're Taranda? Tandega. She's saying, well, that means you're going to the past and actualizing the possibilities of the past. Metaphorically, yes.
I mean, literally, because when you go back into, if we're on a psychological couch, if we are on the analyst's couch and the analyst gets us to recall something that we hadn't paid attention to, it changes our future.
It's the present. It's happening in the present. It's not happening in the past.
Yeah, but that's so to speak, responding to recognition of that past in terms of present decision and action in some kind of duration of the present. You're not changing what is past.
I'm not arguing that at all, yes, but okay. I'm just simply trying to articulate what I've heard you say, to say embedded within the past are things that have not been actualized.
Possibilities possibilities that could not be actualized until retrospect. I don't know how to say it.
Is Whitehead's conception of the primordial nature of God relevant here in terms of potentials that are sort of inherited by each occasion that have not yet been actualized?
Not for me, because as Whitehead said, he created the primordial nature of God as a fiction. That's something he invented, that he needed for his system. So it's not organic to his system for me.
Huh. Interesting. So I know this has been a fascinating exchange. Is Thomas, is your question or comment relevant to this? Because I think Jude's is. If so, go ahead. If not, I'll let Jude go first.
Yes, go ahead and let Jude go first.
Okay, go ahead, Jude. Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah, hi. I find this really, fascinating, because this is part of what I was trying to struggle with when I was working on the intensive stuff. I think that language of intensive vibratory movement forward, where there's no stasis in the being of those vibrations, the future has to be a possibility that has been not just sort of, abstractly visualized by things that have happened in the past, or abstractly idealized, if we want to take the primordial nature of God to have systemic relevance, but is actively coming into being as provoked. Can you hear me?
I can hear
As provoked by precisely that past. So I like what Tandeka was saying. Did I pronounce your name properly? I'm sorry. Okay. That something about the past is now realized in a new way. And it really is about the past, those intensities that have been realized, but a threshold has been reached that we call the present. I see the present as a threshold where that wellspring of potential, of possibility that we can call the future, along with all the other domains of the possible, can't help but come to be, can't help but be just boom, provoked into existence. And I think part of what we're facing in the conversation is the hurdle of, even though all of us, I think, are trying in our own way to get rid of the separateness of the three temporal dimensions and the presumption that there are three temporal dimensions, but we're still, to some extent, I think, stuck with the limitations that the distinctness of those dimensions imposes on our thinking, that I think Whitehead was trying to grope past. And if, to the extent that we can, I think we'll get closer to what I think we all want to say about how that future makes the present happen. And this is one of the things that maybe Lewis Ford was right about. He had his finger on this a long time ago, but it didn't quite like the way he fleshed it out. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out, that I think there's a sense, if we look at the whole thing, I loved what Anderson was saying about the, creativity as almost like I don't want to go completely force-like about creativity, but the way it was described, I forget the words you used, Anderson. Did you use the
crazy words?
I'm sorry?
I used a lot of crazy metaphors. I don't know. I said a force, but I also said like a looming potentiality,
Yeah.
an empty something or other that sucks the past out of its settled state.
It's like I like the receptacle. I think this is what's so puzzling about what Plato's doing there. The receptacle is like an energic envelope without being a container, without being static in its proportions, and it's that energic quality of the fact that creativity is the ultimate fact, or facting, let's say, that we're trying to get at here. So I'll shut up.
That's just so very well put. I mean, in one of the passages in Adventures of Ideas, he talks about how potentiality is active, but it's also this pure potentiality. That's kind of okay. How could it be active? But that's just it, because it's this sort of nothingness that can't resist. And he accepts the Aristotelian principle: nothing is reduced from potency to actual. It's something actual. Well, anything actual that's there is going to actualize it. So it's in a weird way, the potentiality, the potency, is what instigates it. It says, here I am. I'm not going to resist you. Come and get me. You have to. You have no choice to come and get me. And so it's the future is almost what's sort of provoking it all. And I mean, it's not just in those metaphors with Lucretius. I mean, it's really there. And I think that does sort of open up, that means that the non-Boolean logic does, it prevents this from ever being a closed system. It starts with this absolute, anything is possible in that first moment. It gets limited by what already is.
But what if we see the future and past as co-equal provokers?
Oh, yeah, I like that. Yeah.
But then I think that starts to break down again the utter separateness of those temporal modalities, and asks us to keep trying to rethink what we're meaning by them.
Tim, do you want to speak to this connection to Gödel in particular? Because I know you mentioned Gödel's accomplishment in logic and its relationship to what you were saying about causality.
Yeah. Well, I think one implication of Gödel's theorem, that is that from any finite algebra that's adequate to do any real good work, that you can always create an additional proposition that goes beyond the system. So you can't ultimately have closure in fundamental logic. That is, they're self-transcending. So this is relevant, so to speak, to this present discussion about modality and past, present, future talk. We tend to spatialize those things. We tend to think in terms of X, Y, Z dimensions, which are very useful for scientific description and for keeping track of where we're located in our GPS system. But they're very problematic in terms of these basic philosophic points about, as Jude Jones just now pointed out, the way in which there's an active and Thandeka, the importance of the motivations, the active, say, ingredients of both the past and the future potential in terms of action and response in the present. And this is reflected in Anderson Weeks's wonderful historical comments, bringing out the Aristotle and Plato's working with this, that they avoided, so to speak, the simple spatialization of these things, tried to work with the fundamental problems. And yes, the duration of the, maybe even in invoking Bergson to some extent, the immediacy, the active present is as an incorporation of what has been actualized prior in light of all the non-Boolean potentia and landscapes of potentia of the possibility. There's this fundamental quantum process going on that then in the succession of actualization, one darn thing after the other, but it's happening in a way that's constrained from small scale to large scale, local, global, the whole thing. It's a mess. But it's difficult, but it's not something you can simply reduce to simplistic spatialization or a theory of everything that's science only. These things, these possibilities break out of that box.
Thank you, Tim. So how about we transition now to Thomas, who's been waiting patiently, and then I see Michael, Heather as well. Go ahead, Thomas.
I don't want to interrupt this wonderful discussion here, but I wonder if you can forgive me for my philosophical naivete and help me understand what you mean when you say that causation and emergence are complementary.
Oh, I mean them to be complementary with respect to fundamental process, that if you focus on the fundamental diachronic, that is through time process through time, through, in a way, a temporal aspect of the fundamental process, then you're focusing on causation. If you focus on a spatialized way at multiple levels, then you're attending to the emergence aspect of the fundamental process. So I'm using causation and emergence as descriptors for two aspects of thinking about fundamental process at multi-level and yeah. So now I'm thinking of the terms causation and emergence, so to speak, derivative. They're not fundamental, they're derivative to fundamental process, multi-level fundamental process. Whereas we sometimes have in the past thought about, say, space-time metric and causation and emergence as somehow first order fundamental. I'm saying that they come out of my more fundamental descriptors of process, logic, and relation.
Okay, thank you.
Michael, do you want to unmute and ask your question or make your comment? Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. A lot of this I don't understand because I don't know what the definition of causation is. With regard to the past and the future, the past is a matter of interpretation. The future, God who knows everything doesn't know the future because it doesn't exist. There's no absolute time. With regard to Gödel, I mean, I think Gödel's overrated because if you look at his thesis, he begins with, I think it's 6 or maybe 8 axioms from the Principia. So it's all based on the Principia stuff, which of course Whitehead would not follow now. Thank you.
Any thoughts on that, Tim?
Well, I have great regard for Michael Heather's understanding about the fundamental logic. I would pass on to him with respect to understanding Gödel's theorem better than myself. And indeed, I think Michael Heather, well, I reference his work a couple of times very positively in terms of helping me understand the relevance of category theory to the understanding of the fundamental quantum process, for which I'm very thankful. As for comment right now, I'm not quite sure. Maybe if he could rephrase the basic, is there a basic question here? Of course, I understand. I may have, let's see. Anyway, could you rephrase a basic question for me?
Oh, it's a fundamental issue, really. I mean, what are we talking about? We're talking about the future and the past. They don't exist. What are we talking about? Causation. Now, causation. Causation. What do we mean by causation? A implies B. A causes B, or A in the context of C implies B. Quite clear in category theory and topos theory.
It's not, as I said, I'm not using it as so to speak, a first order thing. I take it as being derivative from the fundamental process that you're pointing to in your analysis of the topos theory, that I'm not taking it as somehow a fundamental descriptor. Also, I wish to avoid the kind of spatialization of time-space description that I think you would be likewise critical of. So yeah, it may be that the term causation is so commonly used in a way that's presumed to be, so to speak, fundamental in a way that I'm not intending it. So my apology if I'm misusing the term causation relative to what most philosophers would.
Yes, you're absolutely right about the Boolean, of course. The Boolean is always local, not
local. Yep.
Not global.
That's right. Yeah.
You have to go to the Heighting logic, which gives you everything really. Gives you that third level, and it gives you potentiality. Whereas of course number doesn't exist. There's no zero anywhere in the universe. There's no infinity in the universe. They're just models. You can't. There is. Yes. There's no bottom to the universe. There's nothing false in the universe. Everything implies everything else. That's why everything's a model of everything else. And so therefore, well, that's really the main point, I think, that we can't do anything. It's quite simple, really, in a topos. So there's a top. There must be a top, a terminal object. If you don't have a terminal object, nothing can exist. And that, of course, whether you want to make it a religious god or just some secular belief, everybody has a terminal object. They have a top belief. I mean, your belief may be a more atheistic tenet or something, but you've still got it. It's a natural process. And this is how it all the way that universe hangs together. Trouble, particularly with Boolean, of course, is that set theory. The elements of a set are independent, have to be independent, otherwise it's not a set. Whereas in category theory, an object, a category can be its own object in a reflective subcategory. And that's how the universe is constructed exponentially, continuously from the top down,
Yeah.
This is
Right. So you're getting both the top down and the bottom up description reflected in the logic as well as in the basic science, as Smolin argues. That's very useful.
well, but be careful of bottom up. It's not a converse. It's a jointness, and in a jointness, the subject and object are not mutual. The relationships are not mutual. You see, I mean, if you go A to B, you choose B and you go there, but then you can't get back to A because you don't know where it is. You've got to go through every path in the universe to make sure you get back to A. So that's the nature of a jointness. That's the nature of the logic, the Heiting logic.
Yeah, Dr. Heather, I'd like to be in touch following our conversation here. So maybe Matt can pass on your email. So thank you very much.
Yes, well, thank you. Always very pleased to hear you and speak to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. I think there's a related question about the Boolean, non-Boolean distinction from Jerome. Do you want to unmute? There you go.
Okay. Does my audio work? Yep. Okay. I'm going to read from the chat because I'm terrible at improvising. So my question was, I was wondering if the distinction between the Boolean and the non-Boolean perhaps implies that we are actually imposing the language of actuality to what we like to think of as the realm of potentiality. So could there be a risk of historical inversion between the actual and the potential? A historical inversion that we may presuppose the alphabet of expression that relates to the actual as being applicable to a prior realm of potentiality as well. So that would be my question for Tim.
Let's see. So yeah, let's see. I think I'm not quite understanding the question. So I'm framing the scope of the real is both the order of the actual and the order of the possible, possible being in terms of potential relations. Now, so I'm trying to do that in order to avoid, so to speak, getting an actualism of any form. That by hypothesis, I'm going beyond, so to speak, the notion of an actualism. Now, let's see. Could you rephrase the question?
Yes, well, perhaps if we are identifying what is actual in experience, and then suppose that what is real in potentiality is actually, we can describe it in terms of the same language that we use for our things in actuality, then aren't we using this language that we have derived from our experience of the actual? Aren't we using this language in a kind of backward way, as it loops back to what is prior to the actual realm?
Oh yeah. Let's see. So the way I'm describing it is inspired by the basic physics, the quantum physics, and science and logic in combination. So with respect to how to properly map that into human experience, and to do that properly, given that I haven't directly addressed that. That's a good point, so to speak. If you're going to be careful about, say, contemporary developments in phenomenology, and then somehow map that to what I'm describing in my book, I haven't grappled with that.
Yeah, because the thing was, I was wondering if we could have like an integrated actuality potentiality network, where potentiality lurks within the process, so to say. And I wonder if that could be a possibility in the context of process physics, perhaps. But I'm still thinking about stuff like that, and not really have any worked out ideas about that.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how to respond right now. These are subtle issues, as several of the comments have brought out. So yeah.
Okay. Well, cool. I'll contact you later then.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, Tim, I have a question for you that I'd love to draw you out on. In this chapter, you reference the work of Christopher Klinger and Cahill in reference to this distinction between the exophysical standpoint and the endophysical standpoint, where the exophysical would be, it would assume an observer who's divorced from that which is being observed, so that space-time becomes some kind of arena, right, that's populated with material things and so on, whereas the endophysical perspective would place us back within the world. And part of the context for this question has to do with I just watched this video of a sort of, it's supposed to be an accurate map of the universe, and it begins looking at the Himalaya mountains, and it zooms out, to the solar system, to the galaxy, to the supercluster of galaxies. And, it tells you we're not only going out in space, we're going back in time now. And I feel like the risk is that this sort of exercise creates a false impression of the nature of the universe, an exophysical perspective, as it were. And I wonder what would be your, what would you caution, what would be your response to those who would present this picture without any sort of problematization of this distinction between endo and exophysical perspectives?
Oh yes. Oh, that's a great question, because I think the very reason that Chris Klinger in his PhD work and the follow-on book is emphasizing that, along with his senior colleague Reginald Cahill, is to emphasize that we shouldn't just take this external framing as somehow being complete. That you always have the external and the internal framing. It's analogous to the distinct. Well, so I brought it up before. This is the problem with spatializing things, and so this this wonderful movie by the Eames people that did the furniture design back in the 70s, that then it's a great movie. It starts out looking at a picnic group there on planet Earth, and then it expands out in decades of 10, and then over a time scale of like 10 minutes, you're going decades of 10 on out, seeing the universe in its radically spatialized way. And of course, sometimes then you'll get a description of like going back to the Big Bang, and is this radical spatialized way. So this radical spatialized way is, I would say, inconsistent with what we're now finding out about the nature of the fundamental process and about the temporality that, yes, temporality and extensiveness are fundamental notions, but space-time description and spatialized, say, mappings onto, so to speak, GPS coordinates and XYZ, whatever, are derivative. They're not fundamental. So spatialized descriptions are distortive of these efforts towards getting at a fundamental evaluation of the real, inclusively of both the Boolean and the non-Boolean, the orders of actuality and potentiality, that they sort of, it then it presupposes actualism, that somehow we've got this actualized frame of the nature of the world at multiple levels, and you just have to put your GPS coordinate in it, whether what galaxy you're in and so forth, and bingo, you have a complete this is, so to speak, presuming the eye of God, that you can stand outside of it and be able to see the whole. And I think that the Ten Commandments are useful for this. That is, we shouldn't pretend to be God. That the spatializing things is that kind of thing, that it doesn't work, and it's distortive, and it's, so to speak, denying the basic process. So yes, you have the spacetime description, your measurement and your correlation measurement, coordinate description, metric description is very useful for that, but it's intrinsically incomplete because you have both the Boolean and the non-Boolean, both the actual and the possible, this multi-level description that is needed, that accommodates the fundamental process. Spatializing things alone, however good it is to catch a baseball, for these fundamental philosophic issues is very problematic.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. It strikes me, tell me if this is how you see it, that in terms of Whitehead's account of perception, we've got the presentational immediacy of the spatial present, right, as it appears to us now. And these maps are sort of based on an extrapolation from presentational immediacy. There's a recognition of the role of causal efficacy, that this light has to travel to us and so on, but that sort of gets backgrounded. And so we end up with a symbol. This is symbolic reference, right? This third phase of Whitehead's account of perception. We end up with a symbol that's not fully capturing the significance of causal efficacy, but overemphasizing the spatial container. And so is it that we need a better symbol for the universe as a whole that doesn't situate us, as it were, outside of the causal efficacy that is still ongoing, in the sense in which the Big Bang is still banging, right? It's still here with us. It's not out there as these spatialized pictures present it.
Yeah, that's right. We need more organic metaphors, and we also need metaphors that pertain to meaning and value, the affect. Sandeka, who's with us, has talked about the importance of an affective approach to fundamental process. So these aspects that get left out of standard scientific descriptions and spatialized understandings of things are part of a broader reality. So my effort was to somehow make this distinction of the order of the actual and the possible, and at multiple levels, to somehow open up to the possibility of being able to incorporate eventually, not just scientific descriptions and humanistic description, but eventually aspects of the spiritual dimension and of affect and meaning that I'll be getting to in chapter 8. But it's so as to attempt towards some, so to speak, a philosophic theory of everything, but I argue against spatializing things alone as being adequate to such, and certainly argue against any scientific theory of everything as being adequate. We need to go beyond such spatializing metaphors. Yeah, I very much like the move to organic metaphors.
Thanks, Tim. Anyone else who would like to chime in? We've got about 5 more minutes.
I see a hand coming up.
Is that Philip?
Philip. Unmute.
There we go. Hi, everybody. I was interested in something that Alex said. He was looking at organisms and unless I'm wrong, he was saying, how does this model apply differently to a fruit fly as opposed to an inanimate object like a rock? And it seems to me when it comes to causation that the agenda of the fruit fly is a factor in causation. It has preferences in terms of what its life inclinations are, what it prefers as a physical outcome of different events. And I was wondering what you have to say about that, Tim, about an agenda as an element of causation.
Well, that's a great question, and I defer to the whole wonderful field of biosemiotics, of applying semiotics and the theory of signs to biological systems and complex systems analysis. So I briefly mentioned those things, but I don't adequately grapple with them. Yes, by all means. So what would it feel like to be a fly? What it would feel like to be some other organism? What would these are important questions, and they're part of reality broadly framed, and I accept that. I'm trying to frame a system in which one can make sense of such propositions, but it's yes, indeed. Charles Birch has a book. He's a great biologist who passed away some 15-20 years ago, but he had worked with John Cobb, I think, in a couple items. But Charles Birch has a book called Feelings, and he emphasizes the notion of feelings as being important to biological systems. That's an example of a great biologist grappling with those issues.
So a fruit fly having an experience might be able to ultimately be the cause of something happening, right?
Yes, yeah, well, certainly of its own immediate actions and environment. Yes, I mean, as to whether the level of, say, being able to evaluate alternative futures is available. I mean, you have a continuum here. You have some low-level organic systems and creatures that really can't do much more than mechanistically respond to their given environments. And they're, so to speak, they could be modeled as, so to speak, machines in a way. But gradually, even maybe a fruit fly, whatever, can respond more in some respects among the landscapes of possibility.
Well, I mean, if somebody's trying to swat it,
complex ways, yeah.
If a fruit fly is going to be swatted by somebody, one potential is it just sits there and gets swatted. Another one is it takes off, right, and tries to avoid it. So it is analyzing possible futures in that way, right?
That's true. You're right. Yep, that's right. Clearly, there's a selection among possibilities. How mechanistically does that might be a question, but I think at some point, biological creatures have greater selective capability, access to potentia, that ever more get, say, what we might say is almost semi-conscious, ultimately to what we, in other words, being able to then in some way relate the immediate future to that present givens and associate that in a way that we call consciousness. So that's, I think, emergent consciousness in some sense is emergent. As to whether we say fruit flies have that, a little proto sense of that, as opposed to simply an optimized way of selection among alternatives, I don't know.
I don't know if it has to be conscious to do that or not.
Yeah,
but,
yeah, I don't think.
Thank you.
So we have a few minutes left here, and I think Gary Nelson, you have a question or comment, and then Kevin, if we can fit it in. Go ahead, Gary.
Well, as an amateur at this, my interpretation of the past actual world is not physical. It maintains a physical and a mental aspect, or physical and mental poles. And so Tandeka's comment seems relevant because she mentioned that whilst on the psychiatrist's couch, we reinterpret our past. And I've had personal experience of exactly that phenomenon where I reinterpret some past decision in my childhood and discover, well, my entire future is now different because I've changed the past. So I think she really hits a very important point that the past actual world is both has both a mental and a physical aspect. It's the habits of the entire universe is certainly my interpretation. Now, I'll step back and you can use me for target practice.
So I agreed. That reconception that is that re-understanding of past by all means could even be transformative. Can transform one's life. Yes, by all means. That doesn't change the physical past with respect to what's actualized as such, but it certainly can transform our response to the givens.
Let's see, Gary, do you want, or sorry, that was Gary just now. Kevin, do you want to chime in? I think you're still muted. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. Tim, I am always intrigued and excited about your work. And I want to refer to two passages in this chapter. One of them is on page 111, and it's at the end of a section, and you talk about the logoi framework is essentially a context-based interpretation of emergence. That would include initial conditions, boundary conditions, individualization, differentiation, as well as potentia. And then the whole chapter is somewhat about law. And on page 131, I'd like you to relate the context-based interpretation. On page 131, you say, instead of being grounded in the necessities of deduction or entailment, fundamental physical relations, in parenthesis, laws, in contemporary physics and conservation principles derive primarily from variation principles like PLA and HP. So is there a connection between context-based interpretations of emergence and your notion of law here as fundamental physical relations?
Well, I think the constraints on potentia that is represented by the principle of least action and the physics of minimization principles, those are a type of say a physics-based way of describing context of a system. That minimization principles are incorporating the context of the givens for a system and minimizing the action is setting constraints that then in turn are perhaps what really is being represented by our physical quote unquote laws. Yeah, so they're intimately related. Yeah. But the phrase context-based interpretation of emergence is, so to speak, a phrase that then would be, could then broadly applied to multiple levels of talking about biological systems of, say, I know in works of biosemiotics is grappled with. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to have to call it quits for today. This has been such a rich and deep conversation, Tim. We're really cooking now. So reminder, don't forget to RSVP. Richard put the link into the chat much earlier. I'm gonna copy it and throw it back in now, just so that you have it handy. Oh, am I able to do that? Maybe Richard can drop that link in there. Oh, there we go. There's the events page for the Cobb Institute. You can RSVP there. We'll see you in a month. Thanks so much for your wonderful comments and questions and participation. And thank you, Tim.